I got a call from Bill Bottolato, who was the line producer on Top Gun. Rick Victor, my director of photography, and I went to Paramount for a meeting with Bill and Tony to talk about some of the visual effects problems they were expecting to have to solve.
Well, I think that Tony Scott was enamored with the way that we had worked on the right stuff, all the live photography, how kinetic it was and dynamic.
They had seen the aerial sequences that we created for that movie, and Tony, right there in that meeting, just got out his sketch pad and did a few little thumbnail sketches of the kinds of shots that they expected to have to rely on visual effects to recreate. Very much like The Right Stuff, they were after a kind of documentary realism. What was really different about this picture from The Right Stuff, the different problem we had to solve, was that they were going to have the full cooperation of the Navy and be able to do a lot of air-to-air, actual air-to-air photography. So what we had to do was create believable aerial shots on the ground that would intercut seamlessly with what they were doing in the air. At this early stage, Tony wasn't quite sure, what they were going to be able to get, how far the Navy would cooperate, whether they would let them fire a missile, for instance, which ultimately I believe they ended up allowing them to shoot one missile, which was reused, I think a couple of times in the movie, flopped so it would look like a different shot. But at this early stage, they didn't exactly know how much of that would have to be effects. And so the working method was for Tony to go out and get his air-to-air photography and then sort of see what the holes were and plug those up. We had a good idea that, of course, that they weren't going to be able to blow up any planes, they probably weren't going to be able to fire any rockets, and they certainly weren't going to have any tracers flying around. So we knew that there was going to be a certain amount of that. But only after they had done their aerial sequences and Billy Weber, the editor, had a chance to work with it and start to create the sequences was it entirely clear exactly what kind of shots we were going to need to create.
Previously, I had worked for Lucasfilm, and everything was very manicured. Everything was down to how many frames you were going to shoot. It's very controlled. Generally, there's very little damage to the models. It's like a factory line almost, where you develop elements, you do processes, but it's all step by step. Whereas this kind of stuff was, it all had to gel in the moment and in the frame. It just had to gel. So you did all your work beforehand, and then you just prayed that it went well.
At the time, of course, there was no digital solution to aerial photography, so there was a lot of blue screen motion control work happening at the time, but at that point it really wasn't very convincing. Top Gun, the aesthetic of the movie was, at least for the aerial sequences, was to have a kind of a documentary feel where you were feeling like you were really there in another plane shooting a fast-moving jet. So we called on some of the tricks that we'd learned in The Right Stuff and developing the visual effects for that, using models as small as 22 inches in length that were off-the-shelf model kits, as well as some 6-foot model aircraft that we had our model shop to create from scratch, as well as a couple of 9-foot Tomcat models that were hobbyist radio-controlled airplanes that had to be modified to make them more accurate. But it was going to be a mix of those kinds of things. We knew from our experience that the most realistic way to photograph planes was in an outdoor environment, in real sun with real clouds in the distance, a bowl of sky all around us, so we could shoot in any direction depending on the time of day and the direction of the wind, which is something we had to contend with. We found a hilltop in Oakland, California, that was a tract of land that was slated for development. So they had vacant lots that were graveled over, which made it safe for the fireworks and explosions that we had to do. But it was up on a hilltop with no houses and a clear view in all directions. We had a fairly large crew. We had 40 or 50 people out there to help us move stuff around and get it set up. We had a pyro crew. We had our production staff. We had gaffers and grips, PAs. The cameramen were all guys who had a background in documentaries and in live action, who kind of knew where to point the camera, how to hold focus and keep a fast-moving object in frame. A lot of documentary footage of aerial photography is fairly rough. It has resonant vibration. The camera doesn't quite keep the image in the frame all the time. There's a sort of lot of kinetic energy to that kind of photography. Top Gun drew on some of that experience, but there were different problems to solve in Top Gun, in that, number one, we were creating shots that would intercut with real planes, real air-to-air photography. So we had to match what they were doing. We had to match the look of the sky, the look of the planes, the lighting. But we also had to match some of that kind of roughness. And we had explosions and missile firings to deal with. When you have explosions to recreate in miniature, to give them greater scale and size and weight, the camera is cranked at a higher speed, anywhere from 120 to 300 frames a second. The effect of running at such a high speed tended to dampen whatever handheld motion we were bringing to the camera, or vibration techniques that we were using on the right stuff. So we came up with a way to vibrate the camera fast enough and in a way that we could control relative to the frame rate by attaching an ordinary power drill mounted to the head that the camera was mounted on. And the power drill, instead of having a drill bit, it had a bolt that bolted like an 8-inch disc of wood that was mounted slightly off center, so that when you pulled the trigger, the disc would spin around, but eccentrically, which would vibrate the camera mount in a way that was very controllable. The basic plan was to use these man lifts as a means to suspend the planes in the air and as camera platforms in the sky. Sometimes they were used as sort of launch ramps for models that were packed with pyrotechnic explosives, shoved off, and photographed on their way to the ground. We had nets to try to catch them, but wind was a factor, and they didn't always fall in the net, often ended up on the ground, but we had plenty of them, so we were planning on running through a few models. Because there was a lot of time involved in rigging the planes, we wanted to get as much out of each shot as possible, so we usually had at least 2, often 3 camera positions to catch the same event from different directions. So if one guy didn't get it, the other one would, or maybe we'd get 3 good angles at the same event. Our first week out there was largely dealing with tests. We had to test the explosives. We had to test various mixtures of black powder, naphthalene, gasoline, different kinds of explosive materials packed differently in different sizes in order to decide for ourselves exactly what mixtures were best for what kinds of shots. Probably the first week was spent just testing things, lighting tests, explosives, and so forth. Then we were shooting probably for about another week before Tony Scott was able to make it up. He was still in photography himself, but he managed to come up for a day to work with us, which we very much looked forward to. We wanted him to see what we were doing. We were sure that he would have ideas, and we wanted to get his sense of that what we were doing was going to photographically mesh with what he was doing. A couple of things came out of Tony's visit with us up on the hill. We discovered that he liked tight shots and he liked backlight, both of which were very helpful to us. By being able to be tight on the planes, that meant we could mount them instead of with wires, which were very time-consuming, mount them instead with speed rail running underneath a wing that we would just sort of frame out. The other thing we learned from Tony is that he loved backlight. It made a more handsome image, as well as sort of helping us out, and that the planes looked more real somehow in the backlight. If you have a sun flare or something like that coming through the frame, it just lent veracity to it and seemed to match a lot of what he was shooting in actual air-to-air photography. We had a tight schedule, a tight budget, and we were always watching the weather. The first couple of weeks of shooting, we had great weather.
We lucked out. I mean, the weather was terrific, but it could have been bad. And we did get some weather where we were slogging around in the mud and things like that.
We had some gray skies, so we pulled out our 20 by sky blue backing and some HMI lights in order to shoot against that background and get our skies to still match the other shots. One of the shots that we had to do during this period was the flat spin. We had to do that by two means. One, in close-ups, we used a 6-foot model suspended on wires, basically just spun around in front of a blue sky backing. And then for a couple of other shots where we wanted to see the plane coming right down to the lens, we used some off-the-shelf model kits of Tomcat that were about 22 inches in length. One of our grips took several of these models. We had a number of them because we knew we were going to destroy them. Went up in the man lift to its full 80-foot height. We had a camera on the ground looking up but framing him out, and his job was to drop the plane with a slight spin to it, sort of like a little frisbee spin to it, so that it would come right down and as close as possible to the camera. We bet him $5 that he couldn't hit the lens. Just to cover ourselves, we put a piece of Lexan in front of the lens so as to, just in case he got lucky. And Peter, for $5, got lucky twice, dropped the plane from 80 feet in the wind so as to come right down into the lens. And you'll see one of those shots in the movie actually cut before it hits the lens. Our models had to be fabricated to allow for complete destruction in some cases, in other cases a wing blown off. So the models were constructed with those specific requirements, mostly cast in fiberglass and meticulously painted to match what was being used in the aerial unit. But in the case of a couple of shots, like when one of the Tomcats has its tail blown off, or when one of the MiGs has its wings blown off, the wings were fabricated out of what's called an eggshell material that's easily fragmentable, so that when we put explosives in the wing or in the back of the plane, we could blow up that particular portion of it without destroying the rest of the plane. So we had sort of plugs that we could sort of plug in a new tail on the back of the Tomcat, blow it up without blowing up the rest of the plane, and then replace it after a few hours.
Action!
There were a number of shots in the movie that called for tracer fire. Our initial take on this was to try to do it with pyrotechnics. My pyro guy convinced me that he could do it by building a series of small mortars that would fire 20 or 30 charges of, I believe it's magnesium, flying through the air. And we would just fire these past the model and shoot them. A couple of the shots looked pretty good, but it began to be clear to me that we weren't going to be able to do this in all circumstances. I wasn't happy with the look of some of it. Some of it felt a little out of scale. And we knew that there were shots that the aerial unit was doing that would require tracer bullets added to those shots as well. So ultimately we decided to abandon that work. It was becoming too time consuming to do stuff that was going to match. And we just, it was an interesting experiment, but it didn't work. Well, of course, now we would probably tend to try to do things digitally, although, you know, there are a lot of advantages in working with models and miniatures. Number one, there's the sheer pleasure of just looking through the lens and finding your shot that way. also, when you're working with models in real sunlight, with a real sky, you have to go quite a long ways digitally just to get up to that point. And then you have to devise digitally everything that the plane and the camera and the background does. In this kind of photography, you're sort of giving yourself over a little bit to luck, but for the sake of that kind of risk, you get some really interesting accidents, happy accidents.
We chose not to use those techniques because we found them much too restrictive and much too mechanized. We knew that, the way a plane falls, it's a rare cameraman who can put it into a motion control program, or now in the computer program. The number of people who understand the aerodynamics and can put it into a shot, there's so few, it's almost non-existent. But when you use the aerodynamics, the natural flow of air, and the way a wing will take the wind and how the wind will affect it, that's when you get some really natural events. And that's really why we went that way. We really wanted this realistic look. God knows we've had the experience in blue screen, motion control, green screen, all that sort of stuff, the computers, and we could have applied that. But we just felt in our gut that it was the wrong way to go.